Good evening, everyone. My name is Ray Smock. I'm the interim director of the Robert C. Byrd Center for Congressional History and Education at Shepherd University, along the banks of the Potomac River, not far from Washington, D.C. And my role this evening is to simply thank our sponsors and to welcome you all, of course, to this special event. If this begins to sound like one of those PBS thank your sponsors kind of situations, well, then we're very glad about it because we're very happy to have sponsors for our programs, and we couldn't do it. We couldn't do quality entertainment and quality performances and quality education without our sponsors. Tonight's program with Martha Jones would not be possible without the generous support of Miller Apple Valley Toyota dealership in Martinsburg, West Virginia. And we thank the community partners and sponsors, including the Contemporary American Theater Festival, which is one of our national treasures right here in Shepherd University, and a generous anonymous gift from the Delta Sigma Theta sorority, the oldest and greatest sorority of African American women, founded more than 100 years ago at Howard University. And we thank also the League of Women Voters of Jefferson County, who help us in many ways to plan and publicize our events. We also thank the T.A. Thornton Foundation, Marie Tyler McGraw, and several individual members of the League of Women Voters who are sponsoring Vanguard in memory of the past president of the Jefferson County League of Women Voters, Ann Coulter. So a full list of these sponsors is presented at the Byrd Center website, and we extend our deep appreciation to those who've contributed to this program. We are honored and delighted to have Professor Martha Jones with us, and I will now turn the program over to Professor Julia Sandy of the History Department at Shepherd University for the introduction of our speaker. Thank you all for being with us.
Thank you, Ray, very much. I'm delighted to be here tonight to offer this introduction to get our program started. Professor Martha S. Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University. She is a legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the story of American democracy. Dr. Jones is the author of Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America, published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. This book, very deservedly, won numerous awards, including the Organization of American Historians Liberty Legacy Award for the best book in civil rights history, the American Historical Association's Littleton Griswold Prize for the best book in American legal history, and the American Society for Legal History's John Philip Reed Award for the best book in Anglo-American legal history. She is also the author of, in 2007, All Bound Up Together, The Woman Question in African American Public Culture, 1830 to 1900, and in 2015, she was co-editor of Toward an Intellectual History of Black Women. Both of those were published by UNC Press. In addition to her scholarship, Dr. Jones is also a prolific public historian, having curated the museum exhibits Reframing the Color Line and also Proclaiming Emancipation with the William L. Clements Library at the University of Michigan. She has also collaborated on public history projects with the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery, the Charles Wright Museum of African American History, the American Experience, and the Southern Poverty Law Center, really just to name a few. She frequently writes for broader audiences and outlets such as the Washington Post, Time, USA Today, and The Atlantic. Professor Jones holds a PhD in history from Columbia University and a JD from the CUNY School of Law. Prior to the start of her academic career, she was a public interest litigator in New York City, recognized for her work as the Charles H. Revson Fellow on the Future of the City of New York at Columbia University. Although we don't need our appetites whet for tonight's talk, I wanted to note that in his review of Vanguard, Professor Abram X. Kendi writes, quote, Martha Jones is the political historian of African American women, and this book is the commanding history of the remarkable struggle of African American women for political power. The more power they accumulated, the more equality they wrought. All Americans would be better off learning this history and grasping just how much we owe equality's vanguard. With that, I welcome Dr. Jones to Shepherdstown and to the Byrd Center.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Dr. Sandy. Thank you to Ray Smock, both of you, for welcoming me tonight to the Byrd Center. I'm really honored to be here. And I'm excited for the chance to talk with you all in a way that draws upon Vanguard, but reflects some of my ongoing thinking about the questions that the book raises. So I'm really honored at the opportunity to have that conversation here. And by all means, I look forward to your questions and your comments when we get to a bit later in the hour. My reflection is that fitting Black women into a constitutional narrative about the 19th Amendment is at best an awkward undertaking. Tonight I want to wrestle with, though I don't think I'll resolve, the discomfort of trying to do just that. Now, I don't want you to get me wrong. As you've just heard, I've recently completed a book that tells a 200-year-long story about how Black women have struggled for voting rights from the start of the 19th century until today. It's a saga that reminds us how Black women have always been set upon, as set upon as any community of American women, is set upon winning political power, including access to the polls. And still, it's a story that's largely one about politics rather than law, about strategy, mobilization rather than litigation, about conferences rather than courtrooms and constitutions. It's a story about where Black women were and what they did when they found themselves on the margins of movements and mobilizations, where they were largely unseen, unaccounted for, and of too little consequence for those who purported to speak for women's interests, those who advocated for women's political rights, those who made possible a constitutional amendment that rested upon the seemingly neutral term sex, but also rested upon the unwritten but widely understood qualifier white. So the story I tell in Vanguard is about how women built a movement for voting rights, how Black women built a movement when a constitutional amendment failed them, and it failed them by design. So tonight I want to probe where Black women were, what they thought and what they did, while other women were wielding the Constitution, transforming the Constitution, wringing from the Constitution a certain sort of sense of equality. What stories did Black women tell about the Constitution as they strove for the right to vote? That's my question tonight. We'll look at 3 milestone moments. And the first comes in 1875 with the case of Minor versus Happersett. Virginia Minor was a Missouri suffragist who attempted to register to vote in October of 1872. We're in the years just after the Civil War. And she was refused on the grounds that she was a woman and that state law limited the vote to men. Minor sued. She sued the registrar in St. Louis in state court, claiming that those provisions of the Missouri state constitution that limited the vote to men only violated the US Constitution, specifically the 14th Amendment that had become law only in 1870 and clearly made women citizens unequivocally of the United States. Her argument was that citizenship necessarily entailed the right to vote. And so that when women became citizens by virtue of the 14th Amendment, along with that came voting rights. Well, she lost, first at the state's high court, and then went on to the US Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court agreed to a point. Yes, women were now citizens of the United States in the 14th Amendment sense, but citizenship did not entitle any American, including American women, the vote. It was still possible for state laws to keep women from the polls without violating the US Constitution. And my question was, what did this have to do with African American women? Well, part of the story is that, yes, there were Black women who shared Minor's direct action approach to winning women's votes. For example, they were among women who converged upon the registrar in the District of Columbia in December of 1871. It was a crowd, but there were 3 Black women there: Mary Ann Shadd Cary, Amanda Wall, and Mary Anderson. The women came with a petition in hand. They faced off against the board. And when the board sort of casually rebuffed them, they stood their ground. They attracted a crowd. Supporters showed up, including Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist and orator and statesman. And the women insisted that they at least be given the opportunity to make their applications for a place on the rolls. And they won the point. Each of them formally presented herself. And then, of course, she was refused. But it was dramatic. And it wasn't just political theater. Behind the scenes, these were women who were planning a test case, like the Minor case in Missouri. They were going to challenge in court the district's requirement that voters be male. Sarah Spencer was a local teacher who later brought a lawsuit that, like Minor's lawsuit, failed. The Constitution, these women in the district learned, did not guarantee to any citizen, including women, a right to vote. And Mary Ann Shadd Cary, who had been a journalist, anti-slavery activist, and more, endorsed Spencer's move. She believed that it was critical that women, including Black women, push back against the view that neither the 14th nor the 15th Amendment guaranteed to women political rights. Overall, the effort that season at the Board of Registration netted very little for women in the district. As Shadd later lamented, the refusal to register the women was and is simply a bitter pill to swallow. And still, in the same moment, it wasn't Mary Ann Shadd Cary in Washington, D.C. It was Josephine DeQueer in Louisiana who spoke most forthrightly for many, many more Black women across the nation. It was 1872 when Josephine DeQueer challenged a ship's captain, someone who had barred her access to a first-class stateroom, even though she had paid her fare. Here, for Josephine DeQueer, her battle rested on access to a place reserved for ladies, and her eventual appearance before the US Supreme Court, it turns out, was closer to the center of Black women's claims for voting rights than we might have thought. So it's 1872. It's right at the moment, right, that in St. Louis, Minor is engaged in this direct confrontation at the polls. DeQueer is testing who she was before the law, before the Constitution, after the steamboat company refused her access to the ladies' staterooms. She was headed north up the Mississippi River from New Orleans. In protest, that night she stayed in an anteroom intended for nursemaids and the children that they were in charge of. She refused to go into the space on the ship called the Bureau, which was short for the Freedmen's Bureau. It was a sort of pejorative colloquialism that Southern ship operators gave to the quarters set aside for Black passengers. DeQueer was not a newcomer to this dilemma. Later on, captains and clerks would recount the many times in which she had complained. She had held on to her whites-only ladies' seat and insisted on equal access. But during this proceeding, she spoke only through her lawyer. She signed a complaint. She answered questions in writing and cross-examination. Her lawyers produced legal briefs, but she never submitted to personal interrogation. I think for her that would have only repeated the original defense. So what was Josephine DeQueer's argument? Well, she relied upon Louisiana's 1868 Constitution, a new constitution that had been drafted after the Civil War by radical men, black and white in Louisiana, who were remaking the world. In that constitution, Article 13 guaranteed all persons shall enjoy equal rights and privileges upon any conveyance of a public character, without distinction or discrimination on account of race or color. DeQueer thought this applied to her. And in the proceedings, she heard the way in which the steamboat operators rationalized their end run around the words of the new Louisiana Constitution. She was, I think curiously, said to be like a white man, someone who is absolutely, necessarily, and by definition barred from the ladies' cabin, just like a man. She was also compared to repulsive and disagreeable people who everyone agreed steamboat operators could exclude or segregate or expulse at will. At the US Supreme Court, the state laws that guaranteed DeQueer's right to travel as she chose were said to violate the US Constitution, which reserved regulation of commerce and travel between the states to Congress. Louisiana had overstepped when it moved to regulate travel. And so here, the court reaches a rather clinical conclusion, one that I don't think ever really cooled the hot indignity that Mrs. DeQueer felt at having been excluded from the ladies' cabin. Now, historians, including importantly Barbara Welke and Blair Kelly, have explained how widely shared DeQueer's indignity was among Black women in the late 19th and early 20th century. Those same women drew a direct line from confrontations, threats of assault, including sexual assault, and these moments in which conductors and brakemen and police officers put their hands on Black women who in turn dropped all pretense of respectability and fought back. These were scenes in which Black women believed they were fighting for their dignity and in some cases for their lives. One of those women was Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Watkins Harper was an educator, a poet, an anti-slavery lecturer who shared her own version of Josephine DeQueer's experience in 1866. She was in attendance at the meeting of the American Equal Rights Association, and she was there to debate the right to vote and the future of voting rights in the wake of the Civil War. She was there to face off with figures no less formidable than suffragists Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. They were there to debate voting rights. But Harper, when she got the podium, did not speak at first about the ballot. Instead, it was her claims as a woman, a Black woman, who was standing at the precipice of full citizenship. It was her claims about the problem of these everyday indignities that she and other Black women endured when they traveled. Harper told a story about being roughed up, ridiculed, and refused service, not unlike that of Josephine DeQueer. This is Harper speaking. Going from Washington to Baltimore this spring, they put me in the smoking car. I, in the capital of the nation, where the Black man consecrated himself to the nation's defense, faithful when the white man was faithless, they put me in the smoking car. They did it once, But the next time they tried it, they failed, for I would not go in. I felt the fight in me, and I don't want to have to fight all the time. Watkins Harper pushed back against these indignities, even as they plagued her. What sort of movement for women's votes, she asked, would fail to challenge the sort of brutality that was being directed at Black women? Her again. Have women nothing to do with this? The strife of streetcars and railroads were at the root of Watkins Harper's thinking about voting rights. She continued, not long since, a colored woman took her seat in an 11th Street car in Philadelphia, and the conductor stopped the car, told the rest of the passengers to get out, and left the car with her in it alone when they took it back to the station. One day, I took my seat in a car, and the conductor came to me and told me to take another seat. I just screamed murder. The man said if I was Black, I ought to behave myself. I knew that if he was white, he was not behaving himself. Are there no wrongs to be righted? If women were to vote, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper suggested, they must do so to right those wrongs. She insisted. Judging by her actions, less than a decade later, there on that steamer in Louisiana, Josephine DeQueer agreed. By the 1890s, in 1892, Anna Julia Cooper wrote the experiences of Watkins Harper, of Josephine DeQueer, and so many other Black women onto the pages of her feminist manifesto, A Voice from the South, a text that would guide Black women through the fraught campaign for the 19th Amendment. For Black women, the movement must account for their dignity when traveling, as Cooper told it. There can be no true test of national courtesy without travel. It was her body and those of other Black women, along with their spirits, that tested the nation's ideals. Their travel was attended by vulnerability. Cooper explained, the Black woman of the South has to do considerable traveling in this country, often unattended, alone. She affirmed a collective tale of rough indignities, personal violence to colored women traveling in less civilized sections of our country, where women have been forcibly ejected from cars, thrown out of seats, their garments rudely torn, their person wantonly and cruelly injured. Cooper knew the often tried approaches to survival. Be quiet and unobtrusive, simple and inconspicuous. Still, she knew that so-called gentlemanly and efficient railroad conductors failed to extend to Black women the courtesies they eagerly provided to others. Black women lifted their own satchels and steadied themselves as they stepped down to the platform. They bore this unnameable burden silently, she explained, their discomforts quietly signaled by the heaving bosom and tightly compressed lips. There were innumerable inconveniences and slights to be endured, but the truest burden was the feeling of slighted womanhood, which is unlike every other emotion of the soul. And this was the problem. This was the dilemma. This was the indignity that led Black women to become suffragists and to win the right to vote. In 1913, we're well on the road to the 19th Amendment, and Alice Paul, deservedly remembered as one of the most militant of suffragists, was planning a parade. That might sound quaint, except Alice Paul had in mind a gathering thousands of women strong on the streets of Washington, D.C. Her objective was to use this public spectacle to upstage the new president, Woodrow Wilson, to upstage Wilson's inauguration and get votes for women onto his administration's agenda. Paul wanted a crowd, but the prospect of Black women participating unsettled organizers. Suffragists like Paul had long worked by way of a dirty compromise with white supremacy that put the interests of Southern white suffragists above those of Black women, no matter where in the country they were from. Paul later recalled that she deployed an organizer who encouraged the college women at Howard University to attend the parade. And she settled the matter of precisely where they would march by assigning them to the college section, adjacent to a delegation of men, and Paul herself planned to march there. Objections to the Black women's participation poured in, and Paul nearly balked. So the parade was tainted by the ambivalence that surrounded the prospect of Black women marchers. Mary Church Terrell, the one-time president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, noted that the local suffrage committee had been reluctant. It's a nice word. They had been reluctant to encourage Black women. But Black women's suffragists, while they faced conflicting rumors and many of them were disheartened, still showed up, including Terrell, who made her way to the parade that morning in March of 1913, along with dozens of Black women who shared her education, her vocation. They were middle-class women from circles of philanthropy and sociability. There's Carrie Clifford, a poet and Terrell's ally in the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, the NAACP, in an anti-lynching work. There was sculptor May Howard Jackson, whose husband taught in the city's local schools. Director of the Washington Conservatory of Music, Harriet Gibbs Marshall, and Howard University trained pharmacists and drugstore owners, Dr. Amanda Gray and Dr. Eva Ross, also came to the parade. There was a contingent of those so-called college women that included Oberlin College graduates, an advocate of early childhood education, Anna Evans Murray. There was M Street School French instructor, Georgia Simpson, and Smith College graduate, Harriet Shadd. Howard University students, members of the Delta Sigma Theta Incorporated sorority, joined the procession, decked out in caps and gowns. At least 3 Black women marched with their state delegations, a Mrs. McCoy from Michigan, Mrs. Duffield from New York, and Ida B. Wells from Chicago and Illinois. Mrs. Wells Barnett proudly marched with the head officials or with the ladies of the Illinois delegation, setting out to prove that there was no color line that should be tolerated in the movement for women's votes. Some concluded their thinking about the march by sweeping the tensions under the rug. It was a moment of reconciliation, briefly, in March of 1913. Journalists urged that no color line had persisted, that Black women had marched proudly alongside white women, and that Black women got special credit for having tested the movement in this way. But Black women barely had time to catch their breath in the wake of this parade because very soon they were confronting the prospect of losing the federal protection for voting rights that had been won in 1870, when the 15th Amendment to the Constitution had prohibited states from using race as a criteria for voting rights. Terrell and the other Black women at the parade knew that on his way to Washington, in addition to Woodrow Wilson, was Mississippi's newest senator, James Vardaman, the state's former governor. Vardaman was anticipated and understood. He was a Democrat who had been elected on a platform built almost exclusively on the promise that he would bring about the political death of African-American men. His state had already gone a long way toward this by using its authority to keep Black men from the polls on election days. Now, as a newly elected member of the Senate, Vardaman promised to take disenfranchisement to the national level, and he called on federal lawmakers to repeal the 14th and the 15th Amendments, to wipe away federal provisions for equal protection, due process, and voting rights. He aimed to stop the Black peril. Vardaman's views had a history as governor of Mississippi. As far back as 1904, he had been urging his party to repeal the 14th and 15th Amendments. He failed to persuade, but he held on to the idea and promised that when elected to the Senate, he would come back to this precise question. So with the start of the 63rd Congress in March of 1913, just in the wake of Alice Paul's parade, Vardaman's moment appeared to have arrived. And he linked arms with other senators in Washington who also were eager to make Jim Crow indelibly part of federal law. Black Americans disagreed about how to view Vardaman. It's fair to say that some of them regarded him as a real threat. They believed that he could, in fact, build a coalition within the Senate and make headway, if not succeed, in actually repealing the 15th Amendment. Others thought no, Black Americans had, despite their marginality, won important allies in Washington who would get in the way of Vardaman should he try to abrogate what during Reconstruction had been established, right, as a new constitutional order and a new commitment to universal rights. It's not clear that suffragists saw it coming when a year later Vardaman stepped into the debate over the issue of voting for a women's suffrage amendment. For months, the Senate had been back and forth about whether to put forward a new voting rights amendment to the Constitution, that amendment that then was known as the Anthony Amendment, named for Susan Anthony, and would become the 19th Amendment. These were exchanges that had always been influenced by fears that if the law guaranteed women the vote, Black women might be enfranchised, and thus the Black vote would be strengthened, as would the Republican Party. When the issue stalled in the Senate, Vardaman was among those who pressed forward and offered a compromise. Basically, he proposed repeal of Black voting rights and the 15th Amendment in exchange for women's suffrage and a new constitutional amendment that endorsed that. It was in a way just classic political horse trading, and a crude attempt to exploit the anti-Black racism in the Senate to further women's political empowerment. Vardaman promised that even Southerners, long known to be indifferent, if not hostile to women's votes, might be brought on board in support of the so-called Anthony Amendment if it would win them unbridled white supremacy without federal interference at the polls. Vardaman was no feminist. He was certainly not a suffragist, but he was a deal maker. And the prospect that he might carry the day set off alarms for Black women like Mary Church Terrell. Rather than repeal the 15th Amendment, Vardaman proposed, Congress could do an end run around it. He took the floor in March of 1914 to promote the amendment drafted by Elizabeth Cady Stanton nearly 40 years earlier. Yes, he conceded the Constitution should provide that the right of citizens of the United States shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. To these words, he added a new clause. But in all other respects, the rights of citizens to vote shall be controlled by the state wherein they reside. There's no question what Vardaman was up to. He would trade women's suffrage for protection of the poll taxes, the literacy tests, the grandfather clauses, those state laws that were keeping Black Americans from the polls. Vardaman invited the Senate to join in a sort of dirty deal with the advocates of women's suffrage, who had long been willing to sacrifice Black women's political power anyway. The story goes that suffragists filled the Senate galleries during the debate. At least one commentator was sure he could hear the women gasp when Vardaman proposed that women's votes might go forward at the expense of Black Americans. Vardaman had supporters, and they weren't limited to Southern representatives. Ohio Senator William Borah took the floor and declared it was impractical and impossible to obtain through constitutional amendment women's votes so long as the 15th Amendment remained unrepealed. Suffragists had loaded themselves down with the color question, the Japanese question, and a dozen other states' rights problems. And so here were men who were prepared to vote for the repeal of the 15th Amendment if this was the only way that equal suffrage could be obtained. Vardaman was explicit. The 15th Amendment had been a blunder. Time had shown that the colored man's capacity to participate in government or to rule white men was non-existent. While he had made some improvement, he is today as incompetent and unreliable as 50 years ago. The debate continued. A couple of weeks passed, and the vote was had. And on the eve, well, not the eve, in the moments before the vote, Vardaman's ally, John Sharp Williams, also from Mississippi, made one more effort to cut a deal. They would approve the Anthony Amendment with one small but powerful tweak. In front of the word women, they would add the word white. In front of sex, they would add the word white. It failed, and the clerk tallied the yeas and the nays. But the results were remarkable. 19 members of the Senate, all Democrats, voted to repeal the 15th Amendment, while 48 senators voted against the repeal. It was a correct result, perhaps, but it was not reassuring for Black Americans. And Black women hadn't missed one episode in this political drama. The ins and the outs revealed where they stood in political culture. In Richmond, Virginia, Maggie Lena Walker, the journalist and entrepreneur, let the facts speak for themselves. This is interesting reading, she wrote, and will doubtless cause some of us to stop and think a little, if only for a moment. Our two US senators, Martin and Swanson, voted to repeal the 15th Amendment. Walker placed a great deal of confidence in the view that if Black women built their economic power, they would control the destinies of their families and communities. But she knew that any attack on voting rights did not bode well for Black women's political futures. So Vardaman lost the battle, but we might say, in other ways, he won the war. Those who did send finally the 19th Amendment out to the individual states to be ratified made certain that nothing in the amendment would curb the power of state laws to disenfranchise Black women just as they had disenfranchised Black men. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses would remain in place even in the wake of the 19th Amendment. Nothing in the 19th Amendment curbed the intimidation and the violence that had long plagued Black men and now would plague Black women who turned out to register and vote, especially in the American South. States were left to quietly insert the word white into the 19th Amendment as they pleased, unchecked by the Constitution. So one last bit here for thinking about how Black women are thinking about the Constitution. In the wake of the disappointments of the 19th Amendment, Black Americans, Black women and men together are charged with now building a new movement for voting rights. It's 1920, they look out across the national landscape and they recognize that they're going to have to continue to play the ground game of American politics and register and cast ballots when they can. They're going to have to support the legal campaign being waged by the NAACP, which is using the Constitution to defeat poll taxes, to defeat grandfather clauses, to defeat whites-only primaries and chip away at the legal edifice of Jim Crow. They're going to have to support a modern civil rights revolution and put their bodies, their ideas, their politics, and their insistence on voting rights on the front lines across the American South in a mass movement of nonviolent resistance, finally holding the feet, sufficiently holding the feet of the political parties of Congress and by 1965 of President Lyndon Johnson, to the fire, right, of Black voting rights. And it is finally in 1965 that that movement culminates in the winning of the Voting Rights Act. There's an aspect of the Voting Rights Act that has always made me curious, and I'll be very interested if you will have thoughts about it. But here, Congress now is finally going to enact legislation, right, that is going to give teeth, right, to those constitutional provisions that looked to guarantee voting rights in 1870, in 1920, and beyond. Yet, when the act is drafted, its preamble is curious, and it's short. An act to enforce the 15th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, and for other purposes, be it enacted by the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that this act shall be known as the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The curious part for me is that this is an act that expressly invokes the 15th Amendment, reaches back to 1870 and that authority to now regulate in a powerful and quotidian way voting rights in the United States. But it's not an act that invokes the 19th Amendment, doesn't think expressly about Black women in constitutional terms. And I'm not sure yet how to characterize that. Is it an omission? Is it an oversight? Or is it perhaps that there is a lingering perception, right, that the 19th Amendment didn't apply to African-American women at all? The person who's helped my thinking about this is Fannie Lou Hamer, the great Mississippi voting rights organizer, head of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, who does much of her work in the gritty trenches of Mississippi struggles over voting rights. But Hamer is also someone who thinks hard about the Constitution. Racial discrimination was an offense, as Hamer put it in a speech, based upon the violation of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution, which, by the way, she says hadn't done anything for us just yet. But what I want you to hear is that as Hamer analyzed inequality in Mississippi and across the nation, as she took on the problem of the denial of Black voting rights, the US Constitution was important. She believed that its principles guaranteed Black Americans voting rights, and her aim as an organizer was to compel the nation to make good on that promise. And still, when Hamer spoke on behalf of hundreds of thousands of Black Americans like her, who still could not vote in the United States, 100 years after Reconstruction's constitutional revolution, she noted how the denial of the ballot persisted, particularly in the Deep South, because Mississippi's election authorities were still using those literacy tests, understanding clauses, and more to disqualify Black men and women. She was quick to explain that the imposition of such qualifications and the related terror were violations of their rights as citizens and their entitlement to equal protection before the law. Law mattered to Fannie Lou Hamer in her analysis. But she never spoke of the 19th Amendment the way she did of the 14th and 15th Amendments. Yes, she was a woman, but she didn't see the terms of the 19th Amendment as one that constitutionalized women's voting rights, Black women's voting rights, as that part of the Constitution that also protected her. So I'm going to then with the puzzle of how to think about this 19th Amendment, even in the modern civil rights moment. But let me, before I close, just again say thank you to everybody there at the Byrd Center. for having me and the opportunity to talk through these ideas with you. I believe I'm correct that Dr. Quita Howard Bostic is going to join me, and we'll have a chance for some conversation, questions, and comments. So by all means, use the chat if you haven't already. And thank you so much, Dr. Howard Bostic, for doing this with me this evening. I really appreciate it.
Yes, I'm so excited. There are a couple questions in the chat. I will start off with the question. So there's some shared questions that people placed in privately that I was able to rephrase and put here so that you can kind of see them. But the first question, it says, I would be interested in hearing Martha's thoughts about how we should look at the Black women's suffrage movement to address the legal definitions of sex and gender. And so I think we tackled that first, and then we can go to the second part of it. So how can the women's suffrage movement be used to address the legal definitions of sex and gender?
Sure. Thank you for that question. And it's one that Black women ask themselves precisely because this 19th Amendment that we oftentimes hear characterized, right, as having somehow granted or even guaranteed women the rights to vote. We know how it doesn't work for African American women. I would take here my guidance from a figure like Pauli Murray, the great activist, civil rights lawyer, and much, much more across a remarkable lifetime. But Murray, by the 1940s, is at work on an analysis, a legal analysis that she calls Jane Crow. She's aware, right, that a Jim Crow analysis is premised upon thinking about the important struggles that Black men are facing in politics and law. But she knows that the Jim Crow analysis is overlooking women like Josephine DeQueer and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, right? Those indignities that Black women are facing, for example, when they travel. Jim Crow isn't quite getting to that analytically. And so here, Murray is at work on what we come to call by the 1980s through the work of Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, intersectionality. And today, my students think they invented intersectionality. So we have to sort of dive, we just have to reel it back and introduce Pauli Murray, who is thinking precisely in those terms. How can we develop a political analysis, a legal theory that appreciates that at the intersection of racism and sexism, Black women are experiencing a distinct sort of discrimination that is not manifest in the lives of white women or men, Black or white.
I love that. I love the way we explore intersectionality in such a rich way that we can see the unique experiences that you have when you look at those roles as being a Black woman or an impoverished Black woman or, a heterosexual or a non-heterosexual Black woman. A very interesting question in the chat kind of spins this a little bit and says, how did the struggle for the vote build the political strength of Black women? So I know we talk a lot of times about how Black women experience several jeopardies as a result of their presence and existence, but how have we become stronger, perhaps, given the experiences of these freedom fighters and women who have worked so hard to give us the opportunity to breathe today?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. It is, there's no doubt that it is an extraordinary burden to be of a class of Americans who spend most of this country's history disenfranchised, excluded, right, outside the realm of polling places and elected office, legislatures, executive branches, and more. That is the status of Black women for most of the story. However, it is also a story about women who do not then merely sit down or stay home or resign themselves to being excluded. And Vanguard is really a story about the ways in which, as we sometimes put it, Black women make a way out of no way. They learn how to build political power in ways that do not require them to have access to the polls. One of my favorite characters in the book is Mary Mcleod Bethune, the founder of today's Bethune-Cookman University, a suffragist who, when the violence directed at her in the state of Florida, her school is in Daytona, when the violence directed at her as a voting rights advocate in the 1920s becomes unbearable, Mrs. Bethune pivots and learns to do politics in a new way. She will come to Washington, D.C. She will establish the National Council of Negro Women. She's an organizer. And then she will secure the friendship of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt and discover that you can actually wield a great deal of power in Washington, even if you can't vote at home, when the President of the United States appoints you to his Black cabinet, when he appoints you to head a federal agency, when he empowers you to bring other Black women to Washington, to put them in those federal agencies of the New Deal and mete out resources that are lifting Americans, including Black Americans, out of the scourge of the Depression. Mrs. Bethune learns how to do politics in an end run around disenfranchisement. And it is a lesson to all of us in the significance, the essential, right, role that organizers, strategists, those who work behind the scenes, work the back rooms, work the political parties, all of that is essential to American politics, even as it is a companion today to voting rights. And Black women are expert at developing those alternative strategies because they have to.
I'm listening to you talking about like how the Black women are working the second shift, the third shift, the fourth shift, making a way out of no way. And I don't know if I'm embarrassed to ask the question about, you know, what forms of effective strategies women could express today, but I'll still ask if there were something creative that African-American women or enjoined with women or LGBT communities or, you know, groups who work collaboratively, what are some creative things that you see may be effective today?
Well, on the one hand, I think what I would underscore is that we've just, you know, been part of a extraordinary election cycle where what we saw is Black women doing work not unlike the work they've been doing for more than 100 years, right? That organizing, that activation of local grassroots networks, whether it is our sororities, whether it is our church communities, whether it is our political clubs. Black women are still practicing the politics of 1920 with remarkable and consequential effect 100 years later. So don't abandon, right, those strategies and tactics. One of the things that I thought it was important to say back in the fall of 2020, as folks said, you know, how can we help Black women? I said, no, I think you've got it wrong. I think you need to study Black women and adopt the strategies that they are hard at work at in anticipation of November. At the same time, of course, there is a great deal that is different, right, isn't there, about our political landscape, about our communications landscape. And so there's no getting around what it means to have a presence on whether it's Instagram or where I spend a little time, Twitter, where I spend too much time, Facebook, right? That there's a whole new media landscape that Black women, political leaders, organizers, and more, right, are using still to do that fundamental organizing work. And, I think one of the lessons out of Georgia, as I understand it, is that there's still no substitute in the 21st century for the face-to-face, for the known, for the intimate, that those of us who I live in the state of Maryland, and, the postcards we write in Maryland and we ship to Georgia don't do much, right? It takes folks in Georgia on the ground. And that's old fashioned, but Black women have always known you have to get in the trenches every election cycle. There's no substitute for it in the United States. There's no armchair, right? There's no social media campaign that can substitute for that work getting in the trenches. And we've been challenged around that, especially during a pandemic. But those kinds of coalitions that you're gesturing at, I think the lessons out of Georgia and places like Georgia is that those have to be organic and have to happen on the ground also. They can't be imported or helicoptered in. They have to grow up from the grassroots.
Right, natural, very organic and authentic, right? So I'm dancing around this question in the chat here. And so I'm gonna try to be strategic about how I approach this because I know as an African-American woman that I have a responsibility to uplift African-American men also in my role because, we are African-American people and then we are African-American, women. But a question in the chat is about perhaps the relationship between Black male power and Black feminine power, and just asking specifically about the perhaps outspoken nature of women, African-American women. What do you believe is happening now as we begin to explore, I guess, the outspokenness of African-American women? What types of relationships are emerging? Are Black women more outspoken than Black men? Should we be asking this type of question publicly? And difficult.
Well, it's one that I think, and forgive me because I'm going to come back to Mary Church Terrell. I think that of all the women in this book, there's no woman who was more confident, more ambitious, more fearless in a political way than Terrell was. She believed she was better than everybody. But she was married to Robert Terrell, who was a judge in the District of Columbia, and with whom she had an extraordinarily companionate marriage. They were both politically ambitious and engaged, understood the stakes of Black politics and the problem of Jim Crow and the rise of white supremacy. And they were really partners in that work. And so we can look back and see models of women who were extraordinarily forthright and are married to men who meet them, right, move by move across an extraordinary lifetime. And Mary Church Terrell is an example of that. There are men like W.B. Du Bois, who I don't think is always a radical feminist, but Du Bois uses the pages of the Crisis to host important exchanges among Black thinkers on the question of women's votes in the years leading up to the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Black Americans are not on the same page when it comes to this proposed change in the voting terrain in the United States, and Du Bois creates space for that, even creates space for the very forthright and forceful disagreement that happen on the pages of the crisis around women's suffrage. One of the things that characterizes Black women's activism is that, by and large, these are women who do not abandon the institutions that they share with men, even as they might do important work within their sororities or within the NACW. Black women are still in their churches. They're in the NAACP. They're in anti-slavery societies in the early years of the 19th century. And as a consequence, Black men and women have a long history of in the struggle together, but also struggling with one another over who has power, who has authority, and what it means for Black institutions to elevate women to the highest echelons of leadership. And that remains a struggle even today. You know, I write about the very first, licensed woman preacher in the AME Church, Jarena Lee, who is one of the early architects of the theory we call intersectionality, as she is thinking through the problem of what it means to be a Black woman preacher in a world where that is nearly impossible, right, as a category. Well, AME Church, it's not until the 21st century that the AME Church ordains its first Black woman bishop, Vashti McKenzie. And so that is an arc, and we are still living that arc and that story. I think that's unavoidable. But I do think it's useful to appreciate that those are old debates, that we can be informed by the ways in which folks have wrestled with those questions before, to recognize there isn't one answer, right? There isn't one tradition. There isn't one rule about, as Charlotte Hawkins Brown would put it, what women can be and do, right? There isn't one answer to that. There hasn't been in the past, and there certainly isn't one in the 21st century. But I do think that we all are living through a moment where Black women's leadership is undeniable, and how we think about that and how we respond to that, I think we're learning in real time, are we not? I mean, I think all Americans are.
So I love my grandmother so much, and she's so inspiring to me. And I noticed that you dedicated this book to not your grandmother, but your great grandmother.
Yes.
Yes. And so this is such a beautiful story that you put together, and a display of different truths of Black women. But so I want to know what you would like the readers to remember about your collective work. What is the legacy that, if your great granddaughter were to follow in your footsteps and write, what would you want her to take from this amazing work that you provide for us?
Thank you for that. My friend, Dr. Noelle Trent at the National Civil Rights Museum asked me a question like that. This is how she put it. What kind of ancestor do you want to be? Okay. So I think that for me, there's a kind of historian's answer, which is I want to be remembered as someone who wrote the history she needed to read, she needed to know, she needed to learn, right? Like a lot of us, this is not history that I learned in school, right? It was a history, along with many other Black women's historians, that we had to create. And so I hope it's an invitation to young people to write the histories that they need, right? Because this is a history I needed. I'm not sure what the histories are that young people will need. But I do think that I hope it can inspire that. And that's partly why my family is there, to say, you can start small, you can start close, you can start with, the people in your own family, your own chosen family, when you think about history. And then you can move on to the luminaries, right? That are, whose stories are told across the pages of the book. I guess that's such a good question. I think that this year, what I thought was, it was important to show up and to bring whatever skills, whatever talent, whatever knowledge you had to bear on the political moment. I want my granddaughter to know that I showed up in the fall of 2020 when this country was facing a critical crossroads, and that I wasn't waiting and watching MSNBC in the evening and wringing my hands, that I was showing up every day. And it was so hard for a lot of us to show up in a pandemic. So I consider myself fortunate to have had this book to talk about and to offer up to folks as fuel, as inspiration, as fodder for thinking about who and what we should be in this challenging moment. I think that the women I write about are such extraordinary inspirations. They take my breath away. And they teach us that, justice, rights, the righteous, that's a long struggle, and very few of the women in my book lived to see the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But that's okay, right? Because they know that part of the work is passing that on to next generations. So this book is unapologetically a tribute to them, and a lesson in American political history for the 21st century, which is to say that when Black women leaders show up, whether it's in your city hall, or your state assembly, or in Congress, or the White House, they haven't come out of nowhere, right? They haven't come out of nowhere. They haven't dropped from the sky. They're not mythical unicorns. They're Americans who have grown up out of a powerful political tradition that many of us may not be fully acquainted with. But this is the time, right now is the time to learn that history. I don't think you can understand Kamala Harris or Stacey Abrams or Cori Bush or Ayanna Pressley or unless you understand this history out of which they have emerged.
And so it's so interesting. One of the questions, the questions toward, the end of our conversation has been, like if you were to add to your book or if you were to do a part 2, kind of who would you think to include first in your, when you do the part 2 to your book, I need to make sure I get that right. When you do the part 2 to your book, who are a couple people that you feel you would feature? Who would you feature?
Well, well, dear questioner, you read my mind. Actually, this month I'm at work on a new chapter for the book, and that will be part of the paperback edition, which will come out in the fall of 2021. So not so far off. And it will turn importantly on the election of Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is not in this book. And this book ends with leader Stacey Abrams. But as I know, many of the professors here certainly know, I finished this book a long time ago, back in the fall of 2019, having no idea really where we'd be in the fall of 2020 when the book actually was out and on the shelves. So I believed strongly that Leader Abrams would be a woman of consequence in the fall of 2020. I wasn't sure exactly what role she would be playing, so I ended the book with her. But now I get a chance to write about Kamala Harris, who, some of you may remember, I will never forget it. In the night she accepts the nomination, she's going to run for vice president. She says, "I stand on the shoulders of great women Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells, Mary Mcleod Bethune, Fannie Lou Hamer, Constance Baker Motley, who am I forgetting? Diane Nash. Those are all women in Vanguard. And so she too, right, is teaching lessons in political history that we really need in the 21st century.
Love that. Thank you so much. And it's so, when you say the names, it just feels so good. It's so powerful. You know, your voice is so powerful, and we're so grateful for hearing that. I think a couple people in the chat want to get a little political here for a second. I'm seeing questions like, do you think the efforts to limit voting are similar to the fight over the 19th Amendment? And why? And why?
Yes, I do.
Mm-hmm.
When we understand how the 19th Amendment was drafted, was ratified, with the full knowledge, the full unequivocal understanding that individual states were disenfranchising Black Americans by law, we appreciate how deeply entrenched voter suppression is in this country. That the history of the United States, by and large, is the history of voter suppression. The history of political power is the history of political power won by the suppression of the vote. That is a story we can tell going all the way back to the 18th century. And it certainly is a story we can tell about the moment of the 19th Amendment in the 20th century. So unfortunately, I think that we have been witness to, victims of, a resurgence in voter suppression, especially since 2013, when the US Supreme Court gutted the most powerful provisions of the Voting Rights Act in the Shelby County versus Holder case. And this is the American political tradition, unfortunately. So we are in another era of struggle over voting rights, and I expect that will be our story for a very long time to come. That struggle over voting rights, that struggle against voter suppression.
Definitely. So we have a very interesting, you always have someone with this abstract type question, you know, and then I guess I'm the person who has to ask it. But so if you had to put something into a time capsule to be open 100 years from now, what would it be?
Oh my gosh.
This is like a engineering interview, like a job interview.
You know, it's kind of a great question. And of course it's so wide open. I'm thinking, God, I'm looking around my office. What would I,
you know, put a time capsule.
You can't say something as self-serving as like a copy of my book.
Right. Look, I would have put it in a time capsule right now.
Thank you. So what is it, right, that would really tell the story of this political moment, and the kind of sea changes? Well, you know, I was meeting with a graduate student of mine, Dominique Hazard, today, who has been working with the Smithsonian's in this season. And Dominique was explaining how the Smithsonian's have been collecting and archiving artifacts, for example, from the uprisings in Washington, D.C. last summer. And I think that would be very interesting. So she was describing how, as most of you will remember, right, there's a fence around the White House, and then the fence is papered over with placards and signs and stickers. And I wonder if there isn't some assemblage of those kinds of things that tells a story about sort of the, you know, the precipice upon which American democracy is sitting, right, in 2020, 2021. And I think that might be a real conversation starter. And I like it because it's very material and it's ephemeral, and yet it would survive in that time capsule. And I have no idea what the 22nd century equivalent of a placard on a stick will be, but I think they are powerful signs of powerful artifacts related to our political moment, and say a lot about democracy.
Well, I think I would like to open that time capsule. Thank you. So there are a couple questions about people. Did you know certain people? And so the two people are Septima Clark in South Carolina, and then did you ever have a chance to talk with Nelson Mandela or his wife about the struggle of voting? So what about them?
So I have not had the honor of ever sitting down with any of those extraordinary figures, but of course the great Septima Clark is remembered for many things, including her modern civil rights era suffrage schools, a tradition that Black women had been engaged in back in 1920. How do we teach one another? How do we train one another? How do we equip one another to pass literacy tests, to interpret, understand, exhibit understanding of the Constitution? How do we negotiate with reluctant voting officials? Septima Clark was committed on a mass level to training Black Americans in the trenches, right, to overcome the kinds of hurdles that were placed in front of them. And she would be an honor to have had the chance to sit down with her. Now, to think about the South African case, I think reminds us that when it comes to democracy, when it comes to voting rights, the comparative perspective is always so valuable. And one of the major differences between Nelson Mandela's South Africa at the end of the 20th century and our United States is that South Africa is able to write a new, fresh, 21st century built constitution, right, that speaks to these questions. We puzzle through this problem of voting rights, among other things, with a constitution that was written in the 18th century without any sensibility about who and what we would be in the 21st, with amendments that are sort of bestow voting rights in a kind of convoluted negative. The states may not prohibit voting rights, based upon race or sex. The Constitution still doesn't guarantee anybody in the United States the right to vote. It just tells you what the states cannot do. And hence, many of us find ourselves unable to register or cast ballots for lots of reasons in the US still. So we might not only study the South African case, I think, but envy it for its very 21st century sensibilities about democracy, about politics, about rights, about equality, and more. And our Constitution is just not built to bestow the same kind of democracy as that South Africa enjoys.
It's a very interesting take on that. The last question that we have here, if that's okay. What do you believe are as the core contemporary political concerns that women should be raising collectively right now? So what is a core contemporary political concern that we all should leave here saying? So I'm looking in the audience here now. I'm just going to put the gallery view on for myself, and I see so many different people from so many different backgrounds and different walks of life, and people who I've met and some who I don't know. But can you give us something to do? What is a core contemporary political concern that we should be raising collectively? What should we be doing right now?
Well, I want to say two things. One, we should be asking that question through the framework of human rights, thinking about humanity. Right? This is something that Black women like Ellen Watkins Harper are saying all the way back in the 1860s. Right? Watkins Harper is a poet. She says, we are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity. And no one can rise higher, right, than the station of the weakest and the feeblest among us. That's her political creed. And I think that while it's a point of view that has always resonated powerfully with me, we have experienced that anew, haven't we, in this last year plus of a global pandemic, where we have learned how profoundly interconnected we are in many ways, when at the same time our lives are fractured by profound inequality. So I think asking yourself, what is the human interest, what is the human right, is a way to approach the questions. And then I think, frankly, closer to the ground, we have a Congress in the United States that is, the House of Representatives that is churning out initiatives, right, that are going to give us opportunities to sink our teeth into issues that had really become off limits and the purview of autocrats for too many years in this country. So I hope that you'll find the human questions that concern you in what's happening in your city hall or your state legislature, or perhaps even in Washington these days. But the women I write about, their number one concern is that we not become parochial, and that we not become too narrow in our vision, and that we really aim high and expand our vision to think about ourselves, yes, but to think about others in that human rights way. And I think we're going to have lots of opportunities to do that work. It is clear in the years to come as we recover, we hope, from what have been very difficult 4+ years.
You do such a wonderful job of asking all the next questions with the current question that you're answering. There was one final question, but I believe you answered it. The question was about how often perhaps you thought you would have to update your book, and whether you thought that new chapters wouldn't be needed, but just this explanation of women being perhaps somehow the gatekeepers of keeping the story going of humanitarianism, and understanding the experiences of all individuals as human beings. That means that there will never be a moment when we don't have another chapter, because we'll be constantly focused on the collective needs of everyone as human beings. And so that's such a non-selfish perspective to have, and humble, and wonderful, and enlightening, and refreshing, I think. So I'm just so grateful to have the opportunity, because I'm going to be able to tell someone that I sat down and I talked to you. So I'll be able to add that too.
It's been an honor. It's really been an honor, Dr. Howard Bostic. Thank you.
Thank you so much for everything that you have done and written and shared with us this evening. Everyone here is so absolutely grateful to have an opportunity to listen to your knowledge and your suggestions and advice, and the wisdom that you provide for us to keep with us. And I just thank you so much for being here and being available for us. We appreciate you.
Well, I appreciate you all. Thanks for spending the evening with me, and continue to be safe and well. And I hope next time I'll see you when we can break bread in person. But I really am grateful to the Byrd Center for going the extra mile to bringing me out via Zoom. Thank you, everybody.